This week, we read the Torah portion called Va'era in the book of Exodus, in which Moses receives his charge from God, reminding him of his primal ancestral connection to the people Israel, his people, though he has become estranged from them and grown distant from his own Jewish identity. But in this week's Torah portion, God commands him to rediscover his ethical, spiritual core, to go to Pharaoh and order him to set free the Israelite slaves. We know the story well. Pharaoh refuses to listen to Moses, refuses to be humbled by the power of God and the ferocity of the plagues in Egypt. Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and he will not let God's people go until the entire Egyptian empire is brought to heel and the nightmarish 10th plague comes to strike terror in his own home and the chamber of his own firstborn child. We know from the beginning that Moses' pleas to Pharaoh are doomed to fail because Pharaoh is addicted to power, addicted perhaps also to cruelty. He would never heed the signs and wonders of God's miracles in Egypt because of the narrowness of his own political vision, because of the impenetrable egotism that fueled his regime. The hardness of Pharaoh's heart created an emotional blockade inside of him, which prevented him from hearing the voice of compassion, that voice that I think all of us have inside of us, which called him to notice that the Hebrew slaves were human beings, that they too deserved liberty and self-determination. Vayechazak lev paro velo shama, the text says. Pharaoh's heart hardened, and he would not listen. But the hardness of Pharaoh's heart wasn't the only affliction that kept the Israelites oppressed. The Torah tells us that when Moses came to them and told them about God's plan to release them from bondage and lead them to the promised land, they wouldn't listen to him either. Exodus reports, they would not listen to Moses, mikotzer ruach ume'avodah kasha. They wouldn't listen because the hardness of their labor had crushed their spirit. But the Hebrew doesn't say crushed their spirit. It says mikotzer ruach. Which means that the labor diminished their breath. Slavery and servitude has left the Israelites short of breath. This is not an expression of their physical exertion, but of their spiritual depletion. They are out of ruach, out of breath, and out of spirit. They're hopeless and disconsolate. The very breath has been taken out of them, and they are unable to muster the strength even to imagine liberation. And so it is this combination, the combination of Pharaoh's hard heart and the Israelites' diminished moral imagination, a toxic and potent combination that conspires to keep that nation enslaved. It left the Israelites vulnerable to power, but not to hope, unwilling to believe that Moses would lead them to freedom, but quick to bow down to the idol of a golden calf when someone told them it was divine. Today, that story resonates in a chilling new way in our nation. We are again facing a historic period of crisis as our nation grapples with a similar combination of hard-heartedness and soft-headedness. Too many, confused or dispirited by inconvenient facts, have opted instead to believe and spread dangerous fictions. We are left with a failure of national imagination, a failure of critical thinking. Too many are satisfied with simple answers and the hunger for overly reductive solutions to complex problems. This is the root of soft-headedness then and now, when we are made quickly comfortable with falsehoods and rumors rather than confronting new ideas with which we are unfamiliar, even if those new ideas promise to liberate and bring benefit. Today, unthinkable though it may be, 500 years after Copernicus, there are thriving communities online dedicated to the proposition that the earth is flat. There are dozens of shadowy message boards asserting that the government is distributing mind control technologies in injectable vaccines. Across our country and across the world, wild-eyed madmen distribute manifestos claiming global conspiracies of cannibalism and world domination. Amid the breathtaking sophistication and wisdom of this, our 21st century, it seems that every nightmarish blood libel of the darkest centuries of history are thriving again in the dim corners of the internet. This is the age, again, of the soft-minded, a new era in which logic and reason and evidence matter less than the volume and self-confidence with which liars speak. And today is also, I do not have to tell you, a heyday for the hard-hearted as well. Physical violence and hatred spread like wildfire, dominating the news and the discourse in the media. A new, crude meanness infuses our language. Cruelty animates public policy and popular culture. Tenderness is now seen to be naive. It is no longer taboo for politicians to shrug at the suffering of the poor and the sick, the very young and the very old. Hard-heartedness is the thing we see in men, and let's be honest, it is almost always men, who believe that their masculinity lies in trading mercy for power, substituting violence for compassion. They argue that kindness and concern are tantamount to weakness, that the sword is now mightier than the pen. Today would have been Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s 92nd birthday. When he was just 30 years old, he delivered a sermon that he had based on a verse from the Greek Testament of Matthew, from his Christian tradition. In that sermon, he spoke about the plagues in his day of soft-mindedness and hard-heartedness in the world that he saw, very different and yet very much the same as our own 62 years later. Of course, you know that Dr. King was concerned about violence, about the equation in which bigotry combined with power equals oppression and suffering. The segregationists' refusal in his day echoed clearly the refusal of Pharaoh at the end of the Exodus story, when his repeated, spiteful refusal to let the people go came again and again, even when Pharaoh knew that to let them go would cost him nothing, because he was more interested in his opponent's suffering than in his kingdom's thriving. Dr. King worried also about the soft-mindedness of national gullibility, of people's willingness to swallow even the most ludicrous falsehoods and myths because it makes it less painful for them to consider that the world around them has changed into something new and unfamiliar. So, what then is the remedy? What can we do facing an epidemic of soft-headedness and hard-heartedness? What guidance can we take from Dr. King as we enter this weekend dedicated to his legacy and his memory? And why should we not be discouraged by the frankly depressing truth that we are today having the same conversation in 2021 that he and other civil rights leaders were having in 1961. But Dr. King would tell us that we may not become discouraged. He would insist that just as in the biblical stories of old, there is still today always a promise of redemption, that there is a moral momentum that underlies human existence, moving history forward. And like the biblical story from our ancestors, the deepest darkness and most intimidating plagues come just before the sea parts. I want to share with you a selection from that sermon that Dr. King gave 62 years ago, preaching about that passage from the book of Matthew. Here's what Dr. King said. God is neither hard-hearted nor soft-minded. He is tough-minded enough to transcend the world. He is tender-hearted enough to live in it. He does not leave us alone in our agonies and struggles. He seeks us in dark places and suffers with us in our tragic prodigality. When our most tireless efforts fail to stop the surging sweep of oppression, we need to know that in this universe is a God whose matchless strength is a fit contrast to the sordid weakness of man. But there are also times when we need to know that God possesses love and mercy, when we are staggered by the chilly winds of adversity and battered by the raging storms of disappointment, and when through our folly and sin we stray into some destructive far country and are frustrated because of a strange feeling of homesickness, we need to know that there is someone who loves us, cares for us, understands us, and will give us another chance. When days grow dark and nights grow dreary, we can be thankful that our God combines in his nature a creative synthesis of love and justice that will lead us through life's dark valleys and into sunlit pathways of hope and fulfillment. Dr. King taught us about that creative synthesis of love and justice, what it brings to the world and how we make it manifest. We bring it about not through sentimentality, nor superstition, nor cold and uncaring dismissal of those with whom we disagree. The movement that he inspired was committed to the marriage of two forces: the tough-mindedness we need to resist wickedness and bigotry, and the tenderheartedness we need to see others at all times with the potential for healing and compassion and love. And so to continue his work, we have to commit ourselves firmly to those values, those twin values of love and justice, of truth and evidence and fact, even when those facts challenge our deeply held beliefs. And we must broaden our capacity for compassion so that we can approach the other, whoever she or he may be, with openness and concern. The word compassion, after all, comes from the Latin, which means to suffer together. We need to come to learn each other's suffering so that we can approach each other with understanding that comes from the heart and the mind. On the memorial to Dr. King in Memphis, there is a line inscribed there that comes from the book of Genesis. It comes from the scene in which Joseph's brothers, enraged by jealousy and resentment, plot to kill him and take away his precious multicolored coat. "Behold, here comes the dreamer," they say. "Let us slay him, and we shall see what becomes of his dreams." It's a chilling verse in our memory of Dr. King because it expresses vengeance and violence. It shows the way that rage is connected with single-mindedness and certainty. Joseph's brothers were certain that by ridding themselves of the dreamer, his dreams would die too. but with the benefit of history and hindsight and progress, we know what they did not. We see what Joseph's brothers could not see. We see what the segregationalists could not see. We see what the racists and bigots and trolls cannot see still to this day, that dreams do not die. Without the dreamer, those enslaved would never have been set free. This weekend, we remember that dreamer. We recommit ourselves to preserving his dreams and seeing that their vision comes true in the world in which we live. There are days today when we feel ourselves drawn toward hard-heartedness, when we feel the pull toward soft-mindedness. But at those times, our job is to recommit ourselves to who we are and what we know to be true. That even when we are most desperately kotzrei ruach, short of breath, we take a moment to fill ourselves with love and promise and hope that inspires us, to fill it like an inhalation of breath, fueling us, pushing us forward, and allowing us to continue dreaming great, bold, liberating dreams. Shabbat shalom, everyone.